Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the Together for Transparency second day of events at COP27. My name is Mariana Castaño Cano. I am a founder of 10 Billion Solutions and climate communication expert, and I am very happy to be here in this event, enabling universal participation in the enhanced transparency framework, the backbone of the Paris Agreement, as we like to say, and as Marianne, the SBI chair, even said yesterday. We need everybody on board to make the Paris Agreement work and the transparency framework operational. We are moving from the MRV, Monitoring, Reviewing and Verification framework, into the post-Glasgow Enhanced Transparency framework, now that we have all the guidance from the parties. But parties alone will not deliver on the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement on mitigation and adaptations. We used to hear quite a lot that we need all hands on deck, and it's absolutely true. Here we will hear from parties and non-party stakeholders. We need all hands on deck. And we want to hear their perspective and their vision for this moment, which is critical. We are in a building moment because the Paris Agreement Enhanced Transparency Framework, to be operational, need to have a body of decisions in the countries and systems so that data can be monitored and help the new climate plans to be more sound and effective. And it is my pleasure to introduce our amazing panel of speakers today. We have Veronica Colerio from the UNFCCC Secretariat. She's leading the team in charge of coordinating the Enhanced Transparency Framework. We also have Ambassador Carlos Fuller from Belize, permanent representative to the United Nations. We have Jacob Werksman from the European Commission. He is the lead negotiator under the UNFCCC. And Amir Sokolowski, who's from the CDP, Global Director for Climate Change from the Disclosure Project. And we are going to start with a very short round the table, because I would really like to hear a sort of an elevator pitch. We keep asking all our guests, what does transparency mean to you? I may start with the European Union. Jacob, what does transparency mean to you?
Well, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this panel. I mean, transparency, as has been described, is currently the backbone of the Paris Agreement, but I think it's important to look historically at this as well. It really was under the Framework Convention and then under the Kyoto Protocol, one of the first universal obligations that parties undertook when they signed up to the climate change regime. And because it's been with us for such a long time, I think it's also the most mature of our climate policies that we've designed together, and it has the deepest roots within the governments and the societies that have become part of the Framework Convention. It's evolved over the years from a very general commitment to one that under the Kyoto Protocol was quite bifurcated in terms of what we expected from different countries. But under the new enhanced transparency framework, I think it will continue to be one of those things that we all share as parties, a commitment to transparency and a means to deliver on that transparency, even when we're disagreeing over other issues that might create divisions between us. This is one thing that we have in common, and I think, as we'll see from the panel, the reasons why it is so important that it is so deeply embedded in the climate change regime. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacob. Ambassador Fuller, what is transparency for you?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mariana. And the audience may not know that Jake and I were on the same team very early on, and we decided we need to split the team. We could not be pulling one string for 40 countries. Him going off, we now have 70-odd countries pulling in the same direction. And indeed, as he has said, in my opinion, I call it the anchor of the agreement, of the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and now of the Paris Agreement. As a representative of small island developing states, we need to see what countries are doing to live up to what they said they would be doing. So this provides us with the opportunity for a transparent way of us seeing what parties are actually said that they were going to do. And this then allows us to take them to task, to say, look, you promised to do this, but this is what is happening. So please live up to your obligations. We have seen what you're doing, and how can we assist you in ensuring that, that you do live up to those obligations? Because if you don't do it, we are the ones who suffer. So that is indeed our real reason for having this the transparency framework, and to ensuring that we can see what you're doing.
Absolutely, accountability is key. And accountability of parties, and of course we need to monitor what the non-party stakeholders are doing from the Climate Disclosure Project. They know very well how to measure action and compare promises with deliverables. So Amir, what is transparency for you?
Thank you very much. Apologies for my voice, just disappearing slowly. To us, transparency is, if you take it in the best possible intention, assume everyone intends well as a coordinator. It's very hard to negotiate and to understand what exactly is happening, exactly as Ambassador Fuller says, without actually seeing, it's hard to push without actually seeing what they're doing. But what we mean by transparency, since that is all that CDP does, is very specific to us. It's, on the negative side, my team will kill me because I thought of this analogy in the morning, what is transparency? And I said it's lack of color. But that's actually true. It's data that, or a story that is devoid of a perspective and is comparable. And what do we mean by that? To us, transparent information is information that is comprehensive. There are no, I'm a lawyer in my past, or a recovering lawyer as we were called in New York Climate Week, and there are no hidey holes to have, whether it's within the organization or whether it's across the sector. It is accessible. Transparency isn't just a collection of pieces of data that you can be flooded with. It also has to make sense to an interested, curious layperson. It is coherent in the sense that it is not only coherent within an organization, but with the standards that you're using to report whatever it is that you're reporting, and it is consistent across time. So it's periodic. That's a very technical answer by what we mean, but CDP tends to wield that data to try and encourage and fashion a certain level of ambition, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. But I will say that in the linking bridge between non-state actors and state actors, negotiators and quite often sufficient transparency within a country allows negotiators with best intentions to know what actually the limits of the possibilities are with best practice, and allows ambition, or at least low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm. It will be super interesting to hear from you, because now you are in the other side, but you've been for very long, Amir, working as a negotiator, so this is very rich insight. And now, after these first impressions from parties and non-parties, we are going to hear from the UNFCCC Secretariat, and Veronica is going to present us an overview of the role of the transparency framework. Veronica.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariana, and it's very interesting to hear all the views, and I think part of why we are having this initiative with the Together for Transparency initiative during COP27 is that we really want to hear from you to understand what is the importance of transparency, because we firmly believe that transparency is much more than reporting and review of information. We think that transparency actually provides tools and data that could serve for making better decisions for policymakers, but also for developing countries also to get more support and targeted support, and also to get their institutional arrangements in order to be part of the ETF. So this is something that we understand that parties play a key role in the transparency framework, but we also believe that everybody has an important play to role, and I think this Together for Transparency initiative is about us, about that, about thinking that it's countries, it's support organizations, it's the private sector, it's non-governmental organizations and other stakeholders that are actually interested in realizing these benefits that the enhanced transparency framework we will have for everyone. So I'm really happy to be here, and I would really like to understand from all of you, and that's what you did before, to understand why transparency is important to you, so that we can also give that message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. We'll come back to you. We would like to hear a wrap-up after hearing all these insights. So we have an overview of what is transparency to you, why it is so important. And now we're going to get into more granularity, because we need to understand how do we make it work fast and for everyone. And for that, we can analyze, okay, what are the benefits, and we'll talk later about the challenges. And in order to see the light at the other end of the tunnel of this process, which is going to be tedious because it needs to build and building of national arrangements, which it is complex, and given the different capabilities in different countries, it requires a lot of support. So I would like to start, Jacob, from you, hearing what are the benefits of moving as fast as we can with the implementation of the ETF?
Well, I mean, for us in the EU, we need to move quickly because our new reports under the Enhanced Transparency Framework are expected soon. And although we've been participating fully under the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, we now have to kind of re-gear our system to meet the new standards, the enhanced standards that we will now have to comply with under the Paris Agreement as well. The reason why we are doing this is multiple, and I think we began to sort of outline the benefits of it to us as well. First is basic transparency and accountability, as others have mentioned. We need to know what each is doing to hold each other accountable. That's the kind of the international dimension to it. But very importantly, there is a domestic dimension to transparency and accountability as well. We are making a lot of promises to our citizens that we are taking actions as regulators to meet our goals under the Paris Agreement. One of the ways in which they can hold us to account domestically for doing that is through the way in which we report under the Paris Agreement. In order to maintain those same domestic constituencies' support for ambitious policy of the kind that we put in place in the EU, they also have to know that our partners are moving in the same direction also. So transparency is a way of holding ourselves accountable, but our citizens want to know that the United States, China, other major industrialized countries are also not just making pledges, but are following through on those pledges. So transparency and accountability is absolutely key to this. The other point that our colleagues have already made that I think is an important part of the benefits is the capacity building that comes with following these rules. For many countries, and certainly this is true for the EU and its member states, when you first start out in the system, the first thing that you have to do in order to figure out how to manage your greenhouse gas emissions and to develop your policies for meeting your targets is to know how to measure them. And when countries first became involved in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was the transparency system that was the way in which they began to understand what is a greenhouse gas. It was through the IPCC guidelines that they understood why they had to regulate carbon dioxide, a gas that they previously didn't have to regulate as a pollutant, but now they had to regulate because of the important contribution that would make to avoiding dangerous climate change. So it's a capacity building tool and it's a learning tool. And through the reporting that you do internationally, you actually build the capacity to regulate domestically, because it's by that measuring of your inventories and the description of your policies that you become a more effective manager of those greenhouse gases and the activities that produce them as well. So that's two: transparency and accountability, capacity building, and I would add a third, which is the opportunity to partner. So one of the ways in which we better understand how we can help our partners implement their obligations under the Paris Agreement is through the way in which they describe their national policies through their national communications. And one of the interesting issues that's being debated at the moment in these halls is how we can make the transparency framework a better vehicle for understanding developing country needs, not just in the areas of cutting emissions, but also in the area of preparing adaptation policies and preparing policies with regard to loss and damage as well. So this is a very important channel of communication between potential partners, developed and developing countries, but also for South-South cooperation that can further build the capacity of countries to implement. So I'll stop there. I have some more, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jacob. And before we continue with the benefits, I would like to introduce Racquel Moses. Racquel is the Executive Director, Chief of the Executive Office for the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, and you are a global ambassador with the Race to Zero campaign of the UNFCCC high-level champions. Racquel, we started this event. Welcome, first of all. Thank you for joining us. We started the event giving an elevator pitch of what does transparency mean to you.
I think for us, and excuse me, I was in the wrong room, very comfortably sitting, realizing I was in the wrong room, and then raced over here. For us, it's really about, transparency can be both a carrot and a stick, and for us, it's about the carrot. It's about creating hope. I think once we have the transparency and the accountability, it gives us the confidence that something is happening, and it helps us to understand that if something is happening, then there's unstoppable momentum towards that goal. And I think it's really important for Caribbean nations where we don't have a lot of sort of stake in the game as it relates to mitigation targets, for example. We can mitigate to 100%, and it still will not make a difference in terms of being able to meet the overall goal. But if we can have that transparency and accountability, we, one, can see that there is progress being made, but two, we can have the hope that as human beings, as pack animals, if somebody's doing well, then somebody else wants to do well, and that creates that sort of that positive competition, but it also creates for us that ability to see that, listen, this is taking form, this is actually happening, and I think the more progress we make, that begets more progress. So for us, it's all about remaining hopeful, remaining optimistic, believing that we have the ability to do this, and seeing that in real time through the transparency.
Wow, amazing. If one could briefly describe what a yes, we can do attitude is, I think that Racquel's description of what transparency means to the Caribbean regions, right, with this little carbon footprint and yet so much to lose, but to earn also as they implement their nationally determined contribution. Thank you, Racquel, for that. So I think that you kind of combine the benefits as well. So we continue on the benefits, and we continue with small island states. And I would like to hear from you, Carlos, from the perspective of a small country, which with a relatively small carbon footprint as well. What are the key benefits of the enhanced transparency framework implementation in your country and in the region?
Thanks. I think pretty much what Jacob said, even a small country, the people want to know, you talk about climate change, but what are you doing? What are we doing about it? And this provides the opportunity for us to be able to say, look, these are our emissions. This is what we're doing to reduce our emissions of climate change. These are challenges we have with adaptation, but the measures that we're taking to prepare for the 1.5 degree when that comes around. This is the loss and damage that could be incurred if indeed we don't reach it. So it provides that ability for us to tell our population, this is what we are doing about climate change. But as we are also gathering the data to develop our ETF, we then go into basically a public awareness campaign. When we approach the bakers, really, what I'm doing actually produces greenhouse gases, a cement manufacturer, really, that's my thing. So again, it actually provides public awareness to those sectors who had no idea that they were actually contributing to climate change, and hence they can actually be a part of the process. And the same thing when we talk about adaptation. We need to talk to the fisher folk. We need to talk to the people in agriculture, water resource management, to get from them what it is, the challenges that they're facing, so indeed we can begin to prepare those adaptation measures. And of course, we can then put in the financial needs. That is one of the great things about the BTR process, where never before we had where we can actually tell our developed country partners, these are our challenges. This is the kind of funding we do require for us to be able to address those challenges. Oh, and by the way, this is what we actually received already in this regard. So it provides that. But a very important part, and I think Jake touched upon it, the data that you collect for a BTR, for a greenhouse gas inventory, actually can assist you in your entire development. You know how, what the emissions from all these cars are, what the emissions from the agricultural sector are, the data on agriculture. That then allows you to develop the policies and measures that you require to indeed enhance your sustainable development goals and achieve the SDGs as required.
Yeah, that's why we keep saying that the Paris Agreement and the SDGs are two sides of the same coin, right? I mean, a nationally determined contribution and national adaptation plans should be before all clean development plans, so to make it both compatible, people thriving and in a safe climate. Thank you, thank you, Carlos, for that point. And now, yeah, we keep telling also that countries, parties won't do this alone. That's why this outreach effort is so important. And outreach is something that CDP can speak a lot about. And what are the key benefits that you can describe, Amir, and that I guess that you convey to the people, the companies and the other non-party stakeholders that you are partnering with in order to bring them in this agenda?
Thank you for that. The disadvantage of speaking third and fourth is that I'll often have to say very much like the predecessors have said. And it's true, non-state actors, to an extent, is a replication of what happens with the parties. So it's a stick because everyone can see if it's done well what you're doing. It's a carrot because everyone can see if you've done well what you're doing. And it's capacity building, as Jacob said, or as Racquel said, it's a guide, essentially. So CDP considers disclosure and transparency to be a journey. Sorry to bring numbers into this, and anyone who's heard me speak has heard me apologize for being a history major who speaks in numbers, which doesn't make sense. But 74% of companies that report to CDP start with a D score. Essentially, that means you wrote a word in every column. And within 2 years, 3/4 of those rise to B. Now, it's important to note that our scoring and our questionnaire change every year and increase in ambition. So it's not that they have, I'm sure that some of them have gamed the system, but it's not a gaming of the system. It is very much a journey that happens. The second thing, the only difference between non-state actors, I guess, or the sort of the variation as opposed to saying it's more granular, is that some of the non-state actors cross borders. We work with supply chains. So in part of their journey, supply chains will take with them all of their suppliers. A World Bank report that's going to come out in a month using CDP data. If you're part of a supply chain member that is forced to disclose to CDP for no reason other than that, obviously there are associated motivations, you're 24% less emitting than your equivalent doing the same thing in the same country, in the same place, but not as part of a supply chain. So to us, transparency is also a tool to enhance ambition, I guess, as an endpoint of that journey. Of course, and I think everyone is saying this, accountability. It's important, at least within the CDP context, but I think definitely in the negotiation context as well. The angel and devil theory, right? The theory is 20% are angels and we need not instruct them, 20% are devils, let's get to them when we've done everything else, and 60% literally don't know the way. So it goes back to that point of capacity building, and a lot of it in terms of building accountability. For example, the questions around who within your organization, which is much easier within a country, who within your organization is in charge of this particular element, will require that person then who is charged, once named, to outline a plan, just as sort of part of the steps. So yeah, I think it's all around that and part of the journey and the capacity to actually influence outwardly, I think, as well.
Yeah, replicating at, of course, a different scale what is been happening for 30 years under the UNFCCC Convention in a world which is moving and changing so fast, and where priorities are or moved upside down because of global crisis, multidimensional, like the situation we are now with inflation, energy crisis, a war in Europe, and still not kind of recovered from the pandemic. Racquel, you kind of draw the picture of the benefits, immediate benefits of transparency, the challenges. What are those challenges you identified prevent us from moving faster?
I think with all of these things, it's difficult, and it's difficult, and it feels sometimes that sort of the measuring of what we're doing is in the way of the doing of what we're doing, and so some people are resistant to that. But also, I think some people are really comfortable in a space where, well, smoke and mirrors, and not necessarily sort of doing the difficult work to execute on the transparency and to report on what they're doing and how it's making a difference. But we focus more on the opportunities than the challenges and taking people along on the journey. And we're hoping that the positive reinforcement, so there's so much that can be layered on top of the ETF that can then sort of spur positive action. I love the description of the angels and the devils and the others in between. But it is about getting more of the angels to do more work, to have more impact. And the rest of us will follow. I'm confident of that. We're seeing that a lot in the private sector in the Caribbean. When they see someone else making an announcement and actually announcing a project, they're like, oh, we want to announce a project too. What can you do with us? What's happening in our industry? What are the trends in our industry? How can we get ahead of it? But until they see someone else doing something, they're not necessarily they're like, oh, well, it doesn't have anything to do with us. We're in the Caribbean. We will follow the global lead. But when they see their counterparts doing something, they're more engaged. And I think for us, we see it as a platform that you can then layer a number of different actions on that will just be so incredibly positive. Yeah?
Definitely. I would like now to turn back to parties. How are you approaching this massive endeavor, right? You are negotiators, but when it comes to transparency, you need to connect all players in the game, those who are attending the UNFCCC meetings, processes, and reviews, and experts, and those everywhere else in every ministry. How are you moving into kind of bringing everyone together, speaking sort of a similar language, so that you can meet, Jacob, this deadline that is approaching?
Thanks. Well, I think the main challenge really is one of capacity, because in order for transparency systems to fulfill their maximum potential, you have to feed them with capacity, institutional capacity, human capacity, modeling capacity. And one of the ways in which the EU tries to bring things together and people together is to help with that capacity. So whenever we make a contribution to the Secretariat, for example, we make sure that a significant amount of the resources that we put into the Supplementary Trust Fund go to support the staff here, so that they can help us to make sure that the decisions that we take on guidelines are as high quality as possible, but also so that they can reach out to particularly developing countries to ensure that they know how to implement the rules that we're working on. But when we think about this system being fully implemented, it's not just the Secretariat developing the papers, the negotiators developing the rules. It's then the peer review process and the expert review team process that has to kick in to make sure that the quality of the data is actually being reviewed and improved, and that requires a lot of capacity as well. And so that's another area where we're trying to invest with other developed countries to make sure that those systems can function appropriately. That's just one part of the transparency story, which is how do you make sure that you're following the rules and providing information to the international system. But if you take the logic of transparency to its full extent, and you think about how industrialized countries that are well into the implementation phase of their policies need to gather data in order to enforce those policies, it requires even more capacity. So, for example, we run an emissions trading system within the EU, which requires an understanding ton by ton of what each of the covered installations within ETS is emitting during a particular period. That's a whole nother level of data gathering, of rules, of data gathering, of review that has to be put in place if you are going to operate that system responsibly and to its full potential. So it's a constantly evolving challenge, all of which requires significant investment to make it work to its full potential. Thanks.
Carlos, we know that from the region in Central America, like in many other countries, the Secretariat makes a lot of efforts to recruit experts, reviewers, and it is amazing because when we interviewed them, they all spoke about the incredible experience that it is to come together with other colleagues from other countries to get to know realities that may all, of course, very different situations in terms of their energy matrix and adaptation needs, because we know how Central America region is so exposed to climate affairs. But why? Because I really like the approach of the opportunities instead of challenges and difficulties. Where do you see the greatest opportunities in terms of capacity building and an enhancement of the national accountability systems for Belize?
Thanks. And in fact, I was lucky to be invited to be one of the experts to look at reviewing the BORs, and I indeed found it an extremely enriching experience, both from actually learning more about the technical process. I went through the first national communication in Belize, and so I learned about, and I developed the one for Belize. But exposing myself to the others from different regions really broadened my scope. I could understand the challenges that they're facing. So even though Belize may have something very similar to Guyana or to Trinidad and Tobago, their realities are actually significantly different than from mine. So indeed, it was good learning from them, and of course the other countries in the region that I reviewed. So indeed, it broadened my scope, and I could understand where they're coming from now. But then I actually learned, I could actually implement that sort of mitigation measure in my country. I never thought about that approach. I need to speak to the transport sector. I need to speak to agriculture on some of these practices. So indeed, you do learn from it. But I think, as Jake mentioned, one of the big challenges is the capacity. And so a small country like Belize, and across the Caribbean, most of us have populations ranging from 100,000 to generally about 500,000. A few couple are up in the millions. But indeed, if you are going to be doing national communications every 4 years, BTRs every 2 years, and other reports as required, you certainly have a huge challenge with that issue. And it is, fortunately, we have regional organizations that can then provide that sort of backstopping or assist you in doing the work, whether it's the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center or the Caribbean MRV hub that is now established, or even the RCC from the UNFCCC. All of these institutions bring a cluster of experts on which you can draw on, and you can learn from each other, and indeed then actually live up to our obligations, and indeed then tell everyone else, if a small island state can do it, guys, you can do it also.
And to retain the talent, right? Because we heard that the Regional Climate Enhanced Transparency Framework dialogue in Africa and also in Latin America and the Caribbean, we heard that one of the difficulties in the countries is to retain that capacity because staff don't stay in positions forever because the political changes sometimes influence these positions, and countries that rely quite heavily on international consultants, they are missing the opportunity of building a capacity that could be beneficial for other areas of government. So yeah, this is super important, and we are touching upon support, because it is transparency for action and support. It didn't fit in the hashtag, but we were tempted to put it in. And now from the non-party stakeholder perspective, Amir, how, I mean, we heard you, data, which is comparable. So I understand one of the key challenges is how can we access, if it is on a voluntary basis, as you are doing with your partners, but what are the key challenges and how are you bringing down those difficulties?
Key challenges as opposed to key opportunities is a change of direction. I think most people don't know this. Our questionnaire without answers is 120 pages long. So, I mean, to a large extent, it is like a BUR. One of the challenges is small, medium enterprises, or it is within developing countries. And that is very much the focus of our strategy from 2021 to 2025. We're working on creating a simplified questionnaire that also allows SMEs to get engaged. We have a large, and I'm very happy to say, growing element of, that's not its official name, but it is of capacity building for whatever engagement happens. I think one of the better practices that we already have instituted is the sharing of best practices, which I think Jacob referred to. So we do case studies which we bring out per sector and we say these are the best and this is what they've done. And that just enables the creation of ambition. So that is definitely one way. Another challenge that we definitely have is fragmentation of regulation. In general, and as a rule, regulation is like a meat hammer. When it comes down, nothing compares to it. But if it's a different meat hammer in every place, and most of the world is globalized, then how do you respond to all of them? And our attempts at that are to map the highest and best principles against each other and distill from them what the principles are so that if you report to us, you're essentially answering the highest ambition of all. I would say that there are still several challenges on the way. Another way for us to help is the ambition loop that we do work on within governments as well. So when you take a lot of our data together, and I'm trying to avoid the data and all of the statistics, but when you take a lot of the story given within a country together, you do find out what the sort of the gaping holes are of where things have gone wrong. I will use one last statistic, I nearly swear, which is 78% of companies say they have board-level oversight over climate issues. 3% of the same companies align their finance with that. And the reason is, again, assuming neither devils nor angels, is they don't know how. And for many regulators in many places, as we see, CDP worked well with the SEC at the time and is working now ESRS. And, we integrated to create the ISSB. What we try and do is identify those areas in which a regulator cannot or does not see on the ground what the actual problem is and make them public. So that is, I have more, as was said before, but I will stop here.
Yeah, and I would write as a segue from what you just said, Amir, and now I am asking Racquel, with your hat as Global Ambassador for the Race to Zero campaign, and I guess that you are running around in events because this campaign is being super active both on the resilience and the mitigation side. What are you hearing from the non-party stake actors side as their key difficulties? Why can't they go? Because we have here thousands of representatives. I mean, we are now at 150 pavilion, and many of those are private sector sponsored and events held by them. So we see the will, and what is the how that they cannot find, they cannot resolve?
Yeah, I think for many of them, it's understanding what to do. You know, so they're just like seeing things in the space and not understanding what do I specifically do and how do I participate. So we are developing a menu by industry for each of the non-state party actors to say, okay, if you are in this industry, here are 3 things that you can do. Here are opportunities that are business opportunities that can make you money getting into the climate space. Here are some things that you can do within your business that can help you to mitigate, and here are some things that you can do to help you adapt, so that you are clear on what are the opportunities for you that are prepared to our environment, because some of the things, for example, that let's say the cement industry in the US would be doing may not be applicable to our industry. Some of the things that the steel industry is trying to do in some of the developed countries may not be applicable. So we're looking at things like, you know, more circular economy, more remediation of waste, more things that allow them to change the way that they do business, but on a smaller scale. And I did want to piggyback on what my friend from the EU is saying about capacity building, because that is a huge thing for us in the region and a huge thing for many SIDS. What you find in SIDS is that a lot of the public sector workers are wearing many hats. So when someone comes in and says capacity building, what they typically mean is training. The person generally can't take any time to get that training, much less to focus on that training when they're in it. And so any capacity building, and we've been advocating for this, any capacity building that comes without headcount, that comes without like 1 year of headcount to give that person the space to take in that knowledge and then apply that knowledge, is really almost pointless, because you get people who are in these capacity building sessions who are not focused, or don't even show up, or don't have the capacity to take on the capacity because they don't have the time to implement it. And we have to start thinking about things much more, take a step back and take a bigger picture view. Otherwise, we're just sort of spiraling to nowhere.
And be inspiring also to those government agents or corporate agents who are, Walmart, for example. I heard that Walmart is probably one of the biggest employers in the US, and they have a sustainability team of a few dozens of people, which is big, but when you compare it really with what they have to do, because to green operations, supply chain for Walmart, I think I can all imagine how of a massive endeavor it is, right? And now I would like now to touch upon the translation of all this. Here we try to put together a hashtag and roll-up banners, things which are interesting and comprehensive from whole of the board approach. But how do you translate that into the society understanding? Because one, as a journalist and climate comms expert, I find it difficult sometimes when people ask me, yeah, but the Paris Agreement, is there a police? Is there a Security Council imposing sanctions on countries or big polluters? And then I say, no, but you have the enhanced transparency framework, right? And then how do you explain this to people who are not necessarily so much aware of the Paris Agreement and the accountability system within it? Jacob.
Well, that is a big question. I mean, in many ways, I would say that that compliance, accountability begins at home. It really depends upon having a domestic constituency that cares about the issue, that understands the issue, and that demands of their own government to follow through on their commitments. Because the system that we're involved in here of multilateralism, for all its strengths, does tend to generate relatively low common denominator solutions. And many governments are made nervous by the concept of transparency and accountability. And if you move down the chain into compliance and enforcement, they become even more nervous. So the real strength, I mean, this is absolutely transparency is the backbone of the Paris Agreement. But I would say that domestic compliance is the backbone of transparency. It has to follow all the way down to the ground, or it won't work, and that depends on political will, and political will depends upon, in democracies anyway, the demand from the people for action.
Yeah, definitely. The task is big. Again, the Paris Agreement is not just a mitigation accord, right? It implies a transformational approach in terms of governance as well, and the role of civil society, media. From the perspective of Belize, how do you see, Carlos, the role of the media, the role of the civil society in kind of helping the governments be more accountable?
In fact, in Belize, we have a very vocal NGO community that does take government to task and leads them in the right direction. So, for example, it was in, I think, 2017, the civil society dealing with oceans, coastal zone, looked at a proposal from government of ships, survey ships to come in to look at the potential of Belize's offshore for petroleum. And they started to advocate about it, let's look at the long term. If you do find petroleum and we do exploit it, there is the risk that something could happen while our country depends on a tourism industry, that you would lose that can last forever. And because of that advocacy, the government of Belize actually put a moratorium on no offshore, even exploration, much less actually extraction, and it is now embedded in law. So that kind of advocacy actually helped the government on the path now that we can tell any country in the world, guess what, I think we need, you also need to do the same thing. The race to zero of no carbon exploitation, no more new extraction, close down what is already, let us now do the transition. Again, and as a small developing country can do it, foregoing the short-term gains. It might be 10, 20, 50 years, but we're saying, no, this is forever. We need to put that in place, and we need to then be able to speak to the NGO community, to civil society, to the media, to say there are these other areas that you also need to advocate on. The government may actually want to do it, or a certain sector, the Ministry of the Environment may want to do it, but Ministry of Finance or Economic Development or others may be seeing it differently. But if you are on our side, we can actually get this on the right path.
Yeah. Definitely, and actually we're having a session this week for media, because we need them also. We need to create capacity, not just in government, but also in those reporting and keeping governments accountable. So this is, please stay tuned for that later this week. And yeah, what to say about CDP and its role in keeping companies accountable. Yeah, it's all, we were just having a chat right before about communications, how important communications is, right? And how is CDP foreseen in the way you can contribute to the enhanced transparency framework implementation? How do you see this outreach going forward, Amir?
So there are several possible answers, because there are several classes of where I say civil society stands, where knowledge stands with some things, but going across some of them, and coming from a less organized world than the Paris Agreement, which has one guiding light, and using the word organized there is dangerous. There are several ways. So of course our questionnaire and the journey is the important thing about us, but lots of companies look to scoring and the guidance of scoring as a way to go, as a way to walk. And we are now enhancing, every year we redefine what is scored and why. Again, as a guidance for the journey, not necessarily for the scoring itself, and we're doing something called transition scoring. Essentially, not just how well did you disclose to us, but rather where you are on the journey. And the point for us is not only to have that transition scoring, but it's also in fairness and equity of informing companies wherever they are that this is the future, this is the path that we're walking, and from now on to an increasing or decreasing, well, to an increasing level, to have, starting in March, on our site, hopefully open aggregate statistics of where companies are on a transition journey, but also what that means. Publishing technical guidance, and that is for civil society, that is for regulators, to say this is what they're doing, best practice or worst practice or gaps. That is the way that we would support that. The second answer, in terms of the opportunities and the way to go, is we try to partner with governments directly as well. We try to have the federal government in the US is a supply chain member, for example, and anyone on that chain is then has access to our capacity building because they're requested to, but also has the duty to and is comparable, and holds those that requested them comparable to each other as well. So what we attempt to do is put the responsibility and the accountability on those who also have the capacity to do something and not on those that can only be blamed. And that's sort of at the heart of a lot of it. I never have a knowledge of how long I've been speaking, so I feel like it's a lot. I am very happy to continue, but I feel Racquel has more.
Yes, Racquel, we want to hear from you. How do you see the role of the civil society and the media in contributing to keeping everyone accountable and on track?
I think you're so funny. I love that. But I think the onus is on the ETF and how it communicates. I think simplicity is key. I think to get the media engaged, it needs to be a simple message that they can latch onto. And to agree with Carlos, in the countries across the region, you know, Barbados, Bahamas, Aruba, Curacao, Jamaica, Costa Rica, where you see a lot of civil society engaged, you're seeing the policies follow because the politicians know that the population is behind them and are holding them accountable. So you're seeing the action taking place in those countries where there's an engaged population, and it's because the media is also engaged. But we have to simplify the messaging if we're going to take more people along. The nice thing about it, especially in SIDS, is that we're seeing the impact. Sometimes we don't know what to name it, we don't know what to call it, but we're seeing the impacts every day. And so it'd be so helpful to just use the CTF to give them a measurement and a language around, okay, this is where we are. This is clearly where we are. Let's make this as simple as possible so people can say, yes, let's hold them accountable because we understand the information. Like, I love the IPCC reports, but sometimes it's like pages upon pages upon pages, and it's like, what exactly are you saying? And I appreciate that they're scientists, and we love scientists, but sometimes you have to boil it down. You know, if you can't explain it to your granny or your four-year-old, then it doesn't work because it doesn't matter. If people don't absorb the information, it doesn't matter. So we have to get it to that point, and I think once we do that, we can get the media on board because they're willing to communicate in a way that they understand, and they're on a journey as well. And then I think you'll get people following. And I think a lot of times what we need to think about is who are we speaking to? I think in the region, and sometimes globally, when you're in climate action, you speak to other climate action people. We're not the ones who need to be convinced. We need to find common ground with the ones on the other side who are, as you said, on a journey, who are making up, you know, who are figuring out where they are along that spectrum. And let's find the common ground. We talk to a lot of oil and gas companies, and we get criticized for talking to a lot of oil and gas companies, but they are concerned, more so in Trinidad than in other places, because they see the natural resource drying up. Good for them. Well, we're happy about it, but they're like, how can we get into investing in renewables? That's the conversation we need to be having. Shutting them out doesn't help anybody. We need to have a conversation with everybody. Everybody needs to be at the table.
And find the people where they are in terms of their level of knowledge and their expectation out of all these processes, right? Because again, the carrot works much better than the stick. Yeah? Amir?
Sorry, the unusual to jump in as the Israeli. Two things, because my handwriting is so bad that I didn't realize I wrote it. But I agree with the explaining to a 4-year-old. We were taught when we were at university that if what you're writing can't be understood by an interested 15-year-old, then you've written it terribly, which is absolutely fine. 4 is a stretch, but I accept that. We have a report, which I have, which is unimportant, but the point of it is saying this. BTR currently has 3 options for countries to include activities within which would be regarding engagement, whether it's civil society, whether it's the corporate private sector, and having countries get into the habit of doing that where at all possible with the aid, for us is one of the greater goals that we could actually go into that. And easing it is sort of an alignment, not sort of, is an alignment for everything that we do with science-based targets. So having an alignment internally in anyone reporting and having everyone in every country report through the enhanced transparency framework would be, I guess, the height of what we could do, because then that goes into the global stocktake, which is a better reflection of what happens. So for us, that is the bottom-up activity and would prevent what happened at COP26 for 2 days when there were 2 assessments, what temperature rating the world is standing on. Does it include private sector? Does it not include private sector? And where does that stand?
I really appreciate that because, yeah, it must be in our radar that the contribution of the enhanced transparency framework benefits to the whole global stocktake process is massive. And we need a buy-in from all sectors because no, there is no climate police, no, there are no sanctions, but we have next year global stocktake and that will be a moment of truth for everyone. And now I would like to open the floor for the audience to ask questions. So I see already hands up, and I would like to invite you to please introduce yourself and ask directly one of the speakers or explain who would you like to your question to be answered by. Please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Gary Kineen. I'm the executive director of an NGO called 7 Generations Ahead, based in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. And thank you for the session. You've all alluded to the issues of limits of countries' ability to collect accurate data, limits on human and technical resources, and the issue of sort of, not having apples to apples comparisons. And I was just in a session with former U.S. Vice President Al Gore and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and one of the main topics of the session was a new, I don't know how new it is, but a technology called the climate trace. And essentially, Mr. Gore talked about the ability of this collaboration of multiple organizations using a combination of satellite and artificial intelligence data to be able to track emissions on a global scale with 241 countries, I believe he stated, and also the ability to track emissions by different sectors, whether it's looking at steel, rice, shipping, power plants, landfills, et cetera. And so my question is this technology relevant to the conversation that you're having? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Of course, we need all the resources, all the tools available. So maybe I would like to throw that question to the parties here.
Well, thanks. I think it's going to be extremely relevant to this overall endeavor that we've embarked on. Extremely relevant. I mean, we've talked a lot about the importance of the enhanced transparency framework in delivering accurate, comparable information. But to be honest, and I think we should be if we're being transparent, that data is nationally reported, right? So it's what each government chooses to report on its inventories. Yes, they are applying IPCC guidelines so that they're following relatively rigorous science-based standards. But at the end of the day, they choose to report what they report. It's peer-reviewed, it's gone through a technical analysis, but there's no real opportunity to question the accuracy of the data. It's also out of date. I mean, I don't know exactly, the Secretary can tell us how the time distance between when a ton of carbon dioxide is emitted and when it gets finally received by the UNFCCC Secretariat, but it's at least 2 years and maybe more than that. So if you're looking for real-time accurate data, you can't look to these reports. They have all the benefits that we've just described in terms of capacity building, building trust amongst countries, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really the data that we're going to be getting from these new technologies that will tell us eventually in real time where the emissions are coming from, whether they're going up or down. And so that data will become very relevant to this conversation eventually. In the meantime, it's going to be really relevant to other things, like the corporate sector's efforts to manage supply chains, like governments' interests in the carbon footprint of products that they're importing into their economies or that their own companies are producing. So there will be other more immediate demands for that data as it becomes available.
Yeah, and super interesting the case of the EU taxonomy for kind of finding a common language to measure this. Yes, please, the lady at the back first, and then we'll have a couple of more questions.
Thank you very much. Really interesting panel. My name is Claire Melamed, and I'm the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And our business is absolutely central to a lot of the topics that have been discussed on the panel. We work with partner governments to strengthen the data systems that they need for transparency, as has been said, to monitor their climate commitments, and also, of course, to make the right policies to drive progress, to attract the private sector investment and finance that they are going to need. I think just in response to the previous question and the panel, our strong findings working with government is that there are a huge number of data solutions out there, many of them making use of all of the available technologies that are absolutely critical to help us to track progress in real time. The challenges that we face are not so much about the existence of the data or the right platforms and so on, but are much more political and human and institutional and financial. And the challenges that we face in getting the right data in the right place at the right time and critically used for transparency, for policy making, and so on, are about the political incentives, leaders wanting to invest in data systems, and giving their civil servants, essentially the bureaucrats in their administrations, permission to be innovating and using the technologies that exist. They're institutional ministries sharing data with each other, and absolutely critically, they're also capacity. And I think there's a huge, huge challenge in developing the systems. This is the least interesting part of data. This is not the cool platforms and the satellites that get everyone excited, but it's the absolutely critical glue, the pipework that will allow all of that cool stuff to actually start to make a difference on the ground. And I think we have to think about systems as well as products and the politics of data as we're thinking about the potential of all of these new technologies that are fantastically now available to us. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess there was no question, but we move on with the next. Yes, please, madam. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this panel, and thank you also for this really important initiative. I'm Tamara Lawrence. I'm with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I'm also a PhD student with the Climate Action Network Canada. So in all of our Western developed countries, the largest state consumer of fossil fuels is the military. And when I look at the greenhouse gas inventories, for instance, in the United States and in Canada, military emissions are aggregated under energy. There's opacity, there's exclusions because of national security. But the issue of military emissions is really important. When I've talked to the Department of National Defense in Canada, they say to ask for more detail about how they're monitoring military emissions. They said that because of national security, they will never disclose, and they will never provide any more information. So we have no idea really what they're scoping in and scoping out. And in Canada, we're seen actually as a country that is trying to be more transparent in terms of military emissions, but really it's not the case. And this has an impact on decisions that we're making about how we're deploying our military. It impacts decisions that we're making in our country about procurement. Canada is buying fighter jets and warships, but we can't get our government to tell us, what the carbon emission impacts are going to be. And this issue links transparency with equity and justice. We think that it is not equitable and not just that Canada is spent, and the United States and the European Union are emitting so much from their militaries for war making. This is really problematic to us. And so it's an issue for climate justice, and we think that it also has to do with the real challenge is political will. There's no transparency in this field because in the area of military missions, because countries don't want to constrain their armed forces.
Is there a question?
Yeah. So I would like the panels, if somebody has a reaction to this about what we're going to do really about military emissions, because it's a different type of emission than agricultural emissions from food. We're talking about emissions from fighter jets and warships and tanks.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your intervention. Yes, from those who can have a say about armies and armament, I move to this side of the table. Any reaction?
Well, the EU doesn't have an army, at least of yet, but certainly member states do. They're both manufacturers and users of arms and have armies. It's a very good point. It's not the only gap in our system that has been left unaddressed by the Kyoto Protocol and the climate regime. The other even larger gap, I would suggest, is international emissions. The emissions from ships and from maritime as they travel internationally. Because the approach to developing inventories and reporting policies under the Paris Agreement is based on national territorial emissions. So in order to address emissions from aviation and civil aviation and emissions from maritime shipping, we've had to turn to other organizations to step in and to regulate. And that may also have to be the case with regard to military emissions as well. I know that NATO is developing a stronger and stronger interest in climate change as a security threat, but I'm not sure they've really confronted climate change as something that they might be contributing to through emissions from the military. But it's an interesting observation that I haven't really reflected on before. But I would say it's one of two big gaps in our system.
Thank you very much. Carlos, if you would like.
No, absolutely. I agree with Jake totally there. And I think the issue of, as the world militaries, the major militaries recognize climate change is going to be their big challenge, recognizing that areas of conflict will change in their emergency response will change because of that. So they recognize the impacts of climate change, but possibly the same units that are doing the work on the impacts of climate change need to look at what they're contributing to climate change, and possibly under some sort of that global framework they can actually develop something that they can address. Indeed.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much. And now we have time only for 2 questions. We appreciate your comment. The conversation continues after with other events, and you'll probably can approach the speakers. But please, if you have 2 questions, yes, the man to my right, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is David. I work with Fasten Action Switzerland. And with partners, we have been analyzing BRs and BURs in terms of how transparent is actually the description of the implementation of the policies of the NDCs, but also then the national policies in different countries in Latin America, but also Europe. And we have come to the conclusion that in many cases, actually, it's not possible to see if the national policies and programs are truly implemented. And I don't think this is bad will, but it's also, as you mentioned, a lack of maybe capacity to report on that. So I have 2 questions. My first question would be, did you have similar experiences that actually the implementation, reporting on the implementation, transparency on the implementation is missing or is difficult to achieve, this kind of reporting? And the second question, this would go to the gentleman on my right. You mentioned that there are 3 ways how civil society might interact in the BTR process, and I would be wondering what those 3 ways are.
Thank you very much, David, for that questions. Before we move into the answers, I will take one last. I'm very sorry, madam. The sir with the yellow tie had the question before, sir. No. Okay, then we take. Which one?
The guy in the blue suit.
The blue suit, the man in the blue suit. Yes, please, please. And that will be our last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Dale Okure from Uganda, Makerere University, working in air quality research. I'm from the climate data sector, where particularly air quality, where we are actually employing artificial intelligence to advance smart data generation and championing democratizing of air quality reporting, climate reporting in Africa. So the question and the comment and the question I have is regarding to what one of the panelists mentioned about the lack of political will from maybe governments to provide, to democratize, to be open about reporting. I think from the perspective of the Global South, and again speaking for Uganda, is that in many cases, it's not necessarily about the lack of will, but rather its capacity, because while we have all these emerging technologies and satellite and artificial intelligence and so on, but there is extremely limited capacity actually for governments and the decision makers to take these on, to be able to effectively then report. So maybe the question then is, what are those effective mechanisms? Like where are some of the immediate avenues for accelerating support for say countries like those in the Global South in terms of embracing the emerging technologies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 questions. We start maybe with CDP. Amir.
Okay, I'll try and be fast. I'll go one by one in 3 answers. So BUR, there are 3 segments. There's one that says tracking cooperation good practice. There's another that says tracking progress, and there's a third that says all other information. Like everything that has to do with law and everything that has to do with international coordination, if enough do it, it becomes the habit that that is the correct way to do it. Happy to discuss more. With regards to Uganda, CDP has recently signed and has expressed and doing this MOU with the focal points of Brazil and have worked with the Italian government to supply a lot of the data where required. I'm very happy to discuss that. And then has to do with the politics of data. I think it's a known fact, definitely within the COP, that technology is not necessarily the biggest problem. It is always politics. So I would definitely use tracing and tracking, and CDP is increasing its use on such technologies. It's a problem of how you attribute them. And I have an answer about the military as well, but I will speak to that later if you wish.
Thank you very much, Amir. And very quickly now, concerning this need for support, we are going to ask Jacob and Carlo to give, because it's about transparency for action and for support, and all these mechanisms will have benefits in that sense as well. So your thoughts, Jacob? Red.
I need some capacity building as well. Well, I mean, there are 2 dimensions of transparency and support. There's transparency of support, which we really hadn't talked about yet, which is how effectively are donors disclosing information about the money that they're delivering under their commitments under the Paris Agreement, under the Convention. But this is about support for transparency. As I understood the question, that I think we had posited that one of the concerns that some developing countries and other countries have about participating in transparency is that they're nervous about being exposed in terms of their lack of compliance. And I do think that that is a legitimate concern. Part of it does emerge from an enhanced transparency system that we've agreed will be applicable to all, and a peer review system that we've agreed will be applicable to all, but in circumstances where the playing field of capacity isn't level. So, a peer review process kind of depends on the assumption that everyone sitting around the table is a peer with regard to capacity. And that isn't always the case, right? So I think we have to, build trust in the system and encourage more transparency and more participation through building that capacity. But there will be a lag period before we can get everyone up to the same level of confidence. I would say that there is, fortunately, I think for the climate problem, a good correlation between the amount of emissions that a party emits and their capacity to participate in transparency systems. In other words, the major economies are all pretty good at tracking their emissions and reporting their emissions. And so, at least from that point of view, the system can still be effective, I think, without additional capacity to those bigger countries.
Thanks. So on the issue of the support, certainly the Global Environmental Facility is mandated to provide all developing countries with the support to develop their BORs, and eventually it will be the BTRs. And in fact, they already have a process to assist countries to develop, to put in the BTR systems in place. So that support is there, and it's just a matter of accessing that support. The second has to do with the capacity of countries to implement them. So there are various ways. In the Caribbean, some countries have used their national universities or regional universities to undertake parts of their BTRs, the greenhouse gas inventories, some of the adaptation measures are done by universities. Or there are regional organizations, again, that can do it on their behalf. So there is opportunities, and I believe in the Global South, we need to look at regional organizations in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, that already exist, that governments contribute to, that they support, and then they would then actually mandate those organizations to undertake those reports on them. The countries can access the funding and then provide it to these organizations to implement their BTRs.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And we are going to close with a brief wrap-up from Veronica.
Thank you, Mariana, and I would like to thank all of you here and from the fall as well for participating to this event and also for providing your perspectives. I think universal participation is key to getting into the enhanced transparency framework, and I'm really happy to hear that you also think this is important and are here. So with that,
thank you very much. Thank you, Veronica. And thank you to everyone, Jacob, Carlos, Amir, Racquel. Thanks a lot. Thank you.